Hey, we'll see how this goes. Welcome to April Fool's Day, 1st of April, and welcome to Wednesday office hours. I'm starting a little early today only because there's usually no one here when I start. So I'm just going to do this, and people can go back to the recording. So, what I've been thinking about is transforming values into prices of production. And that's, we've looked at before the MELT, that is the monetary equivalent of labor time, and theories of price. And it is always amazing how we've had this history of, it's not like Marx didn't know what prices were. He just wanted to see it in a in particular light, and its relation um, to labor, I would assert, is a kind of indexical one. That is that you have this kind of um, connection or set of relations, not unlike social relations, between labor labor time or labor power and ways in which we can talk about markets and price. So that should not be controversial, but in fact it is, because some people think that by not talking about or by avoiding or setting labor to the side, you're not sort of engaged with questions that ultimately deal with class struggle. Let me just say that that's kind of always what is needed, and what Marx is pointing to, and that this is not um, problematic for Marxism to be able to talk about value and price in a way that allows us to get greater precision in terms of doing analysis. And often that's, there's a whole other way of looking at this, of course. That is the idea that you could not think of any quantitative relations at all, which in some writing exists. But the reality, of course, is that there is quantity still exists in the world, and you still sort of want to deal with it, not just sort of simply set it to the aside to pursue other kinds of analysis, mainly because it's not perfectly neutral, but it has interesting elements, um, and it's necessary in order to do I think more precise work. So here's one quote that I hope is useful, and that is this idea that value is neither reduced to money, because that's the whole front end of the problem of the money commodity or money, and they're not identical, nor to abstract labor, which also has its own, just by certifying it as abstract as opposed to concrete, already raises some questions, but subsumes value subsumes a definite relation between the two, and value is that measure. That is, it seems more epiphenomenal or ephemeral, but it is there. It's not like it doesn't. It's not there. It has components. It has categories. It has all of those things. And the issue of reducing it to money is, comes very convenient. It has numbers. There's currency. There's all kinds of other things. But note, of course, that money as number can be problematic. So, and we know this. I mean, this, and this is pre-capitalist. That, and also the question of abstract labor is one that in a pre-capitalist context, it's there. You just don't know how to deal with it until you get to capitalism, because capitalism makes it, clarifies it, if you want to call that clarifying, but in the same sense that there's a capitalocene as opposed to anthropocene, there is something that obviously relates the two, but there also are, of course, the obvious divisions that are necessary. And so, it is this bigger historical materialist question of how is it that we can make these comments about progression, ideology, all kinds of other things, and yet still, as you can read in the literature, have not a good handle. I mean, you'll have a good handle on your own kind of framing of the problem, but the problem itself is somewhat elusive, and I would assert that's one issue that comes up under value form analysis, for example. And by calling it value form, in fact, is an attempt to not necessarily reify it, but and talk about this subsumption of relations, of course, but to try and make it a more palpable kind of piece for analysis, and and of course, in translation, value form, it obviously has a meaning, and it is a kind of way in which you can spatially orient value in one sense. That might take a little bit of work to do that, but I mean, it's there, and you can't sort of ignore it. But you can also sort of say, well, that's sort of that side of the argument, and it doesn't, it can't be quantified, or its quantification has this sort of set of constraints built into it, or a set of ideas that are necessary in order to get there. And that's this problem with a kind of dual versus single system analysis. And it's unfortunate that it took so damn long to get to, and it probably needed to take that long in some ways. That is, in terms of recovering sort of Marxist writings, seeing where the Grundrisse fits in, seeing capital in its relation to other things by Marx, and then of course seeing Engels in his own sort of situation or place relative to of the central ideas of capital. So there's a little table that comes up, and as I said before, I've been doing some letting. It's perhaps it's somewhat of a laziness, I suppose, but to allow AI to do my outlines or to do my tables is sort of useful, and not that I'm fixated, nor do I fully believe or am committed to these tables, but I just find them as sort of interesting tools. So, there's issues that go back to Samuelson, and it's actually important to go back and look at Samuelson, only because Samuelson is looking at Marx, because he's not a Marxist, and in some ways is kind of clueless about certain other ideological issues. But in fact, he does address certain kinds of issues that provide us with a not anything that we need to refute, and I think that's the problem. Although obviously Samuelson makes a particular takes a particular position and against which other people, Abelherder, etc., have to sort of come to grips with, whether it's a question of belief or precision or ideology, more specifically. That's a kind of issue. But if you, as some people have said, if you didn't have Samuelson, you'd have to invent him, because of it. He does represent a system or a series of counter arguments, or to getting to what the real goal is. Of course, is to get to a heterodox approach, or a non-neoclassical approach, that allows for the important issues that need to be sort of explicated. Like, for example, exploitation. On the one hand, you can attempt to measure it. On the other hand, one shouldn't get too obsessed with this idea that you can sort of say, well, that's exploitation and that's not exploitation, without going to the deeper part of it, and that is creating surplus value, or that surplus value gets created, and that it has a family resemblance or an identity with profit. So the counter-argument of Samuelson is that Marx's transformation is a logical fail. He just replaces one set of numbers with another set of numbers. Now, that's arguable, but ultimately, that doesn't really get us anywhere. It does show that there is some fluidity in the argument, and that's sort of that's important as well. And it points to the kind of position that, as you can see with Baumol below, Baumel's not a Marxist either. Although I would say that Baumel's more liberal, perhaps, than Samuelson. Not that Samuelson is not liberal, but that Baumol actually is sort of responsive to institutional, cultural arguments. I think that comes because Baumol was more of not simply a faculty member, but that he was a bureaucrat, or he thought in larger terms, because he went into administration, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, and he sees it not like Samuelson does in terms of this larger kind of mathematical or quantitative framework, but rather to see it in this, to see Marxism situated in this kind of set of social relations. So the key counter-argument, Samuelson is looking for a price calculator. That's the point I was making before. Can we, in fact, get more stuff, get more precision, if you can get a better handle on price, knowing, of course, that price is problematic in and of itself. So that's not, it's just, it has all the other kinds of contingencies always built within it. And we know this for a variety of points of view, is that, that there's not perfect symmetry in this kind of problem. So anyway, Marx was explaining the social source of profit, because profit does have a social source, if you consider profit as having some equivalence, and not necessarily identity, but equivalence with surplus value. So anyway, the third one, of course, is Anwar Sheikh, and the transformation problem, that is values and prices, is an iterative algorithm. That is, that it is structurally speaking, it's repeatable. It occurs, multiple times in, serial form or sequential form. And it is, as I think that you can see where we've been headed, is that it always is about a dynamic situation where things move. And what's reflective of that, of course, is the idea of turnover, the idea that there are obviously Department 1 and Department 2, and that these circuits or cycles, are not identical. They unfold over time and space, as David Harvey would tell us, and so that there's not a single, from the Samuelson moment, a kind of erasure and that I've been sort of fiddling around with that idea about Samuelson's erasure is in fact a way in which, decades later, you can talk in a, as it were, a more deconstructive way about the application of the idea of erasure, and that is not to wholly buy into the notion of what counts as, deconstruction's relationship to totality and, all the totalizing discourse and blah, 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 but rather to think of it as some deconstruction folks think of it, as having a clear political element. This gets us back to the Baumol position on the social source of profit, to look at that question of difference, if you want to do this in English, and erasure and replacement. It's not erasure and replacement, but rather as an iterative algorithm is constantly changing, or and so replacement is not, it's not never a kind of corresponding replacement. Rather, it goes, it's dynamic, goes up, down, moves around. And this is why, if you buy into, particularly at scale, Steve Keen's argument that of this idea that this an iterative algorithm, is that you can see from a structurally dynamic point of view why and how that happens, and of course, using it as a tool for evaluation can be problematic because you're dealing with large numbers and big data and all kinds of other matters. But I think it's important to appreciate that those kind of structural questions that come from looking at it from this other kind of structural dynamics point of view, which is where Sheikh was headed anyway. With all due respect, Sheikh is headed there in a certain other way, but of course his commitment to positioning Marx within the context of classical political economy is an important, career-long. It's an important task, and one that is, ultimately the goal, or whatever. If there was an objective to situate Marx more carefully within that discourse, Sheikh is one of so many people who have actually managed to do that. Now, similarly, you can deal with, neo-Ricardians, post-Ricardians, and you might, this is that whole Straffa thing, so that when you talk about certain issues, you've already sort of constrained certain elements of it, and which is what the TSSI people are, the temporal single system interpretation is doing, and and that should not be problematic, although some people see it as such simply because of the idea that is trying to reduce or compress, or however you want to think about it, these kinds of ideas to a single system. While it works from a mathematical point of view, and works better from a mathematical point of view, essentially, and one could argue, by not necessarily arguing that, is that this is the same path that went from that followed in the idea of or the development of neoclassical economics. That is, that you had more linear, more matrix-oriented ways in which you could tackle the problems. And it should not be controversial, because it's pretty clear that mathematics itself moved in a certain way that was amenable to applying it to elements of production. The niggling issue, as it were, and a 21st century issue, is how does that fully work through certain issues of distribution. And when you think about capital itself, because capital was not simply one or three things in the 19th century, it really was a lot of different things. It's just that we haven't spent the time to get down there and kind of apply counterfactually, as it were, these kinds of ideas. And in fact, when people tried to do it, this is the, sort of the cliometric arguments, you get into trouble because the data's not good, the historical arguments are not good. You have a whole combination of these problems that on the one hand, can give you a certain indicator with a certain range or scale of activity, um, but it's not about sample size, but it is somewhat about scale or scaling up and down, to be able to assess, how is it that a certain concept, which you could argue that it's pre-capitalist or blah blah blah, but ultimately you're still dealing with the same kinds of issues. That is, that there's land, labor, and capital, and that capital was there. It's always been there. It's just that simply, it was chosen to not necessarily conceive of it that way, but in fact, and this is an argument that I'll probably have to do somewhere else, is and I don't think Bradell goes there, but I do think in the historical context, you can argue that, and I think it is possible to argue that there are pre-capitalist kind of formations that are necessary to be engaged. And the simple example of that, to me anyway, and it's one that historically has not been, to me, but then again, I have to read more, is fully explicated, is the idea of usury, for example, because usury terms are exactly, well, resemble, let's put it that way, um, ways in which we can talk about surplus value and profit and financialization in kind of a much more vague way, but it doesn't have the same kind of velocity conditions and whatever of the 20th and 21st centuries, but you could say that some of that still exists, and in fact, I think you can argue that even from the kind of sparseness of 17th century data, but that's just, I haven't had time to do that. But I do think it's there, and some of the literature suggests that you can go there. Anyway, Kleiman. Now, Kleiman represents a whole other side of this argument, rather than rather than Heinrich going in one direction. In the other direction, Kleiman and Mosley and a bunch of other folks are going in the other direction, even if that's can be called a direction. And this idea of erasure, of course, as we began at the beginning, is this idea of replacement. That it's just sleight of hand. That Marx is just doing sleight of hand, and that's just not the case. And you can see that within the context even of the kind of the history of economics or history of economic thought that goes into this. So the erasure is a flaw in Samuelson's own model, a dual system model, not in Marx's original logic. And in fact, that's sort of the Kleiman argument, is that there is an original logic that fits with a variety of other activity, and you can see the parallels in, Romer, Mosley, etc., to try and get that kind of worked out. And that's why there is, in fact, or I would argue, that you have this new interpretation problem among many other ideas. So anyway, that's how far a table can mislead us, perhaps. So I came across, and not so much I came across, actually, I have, I've been looking at this for a while, and I find his work interesting, although I think he's taken some interesting detours since he finished working on it. But Ian Paul Wright has approached this value problem in useful ways in which that can be talked about in both the kind of algebraic sense that we find Marx, that's convenient for us from a Marxian point of view, and also the larger classical kinds of questions. So Wright's dissertation is worth that kind of reading, and he got a lot of response to it, in the sense, in the European context, I think that you don't get that same kind of attention for a 2016 dissertation in the United States, but that's just an opinion. Anyway, the abstract for this paper, The Law of Value Contribution to the Classical Approach to Economic Analysis by Ian Paul Wright of 2015-2016, this thesis contributes to our understanding of the relationship between, this is a spin-off article from the dissertation. So this thesis contributes to our understanding of the relationship between the material activity of human labor and the monetary forms of an economy by examining the theoretical foundations of the classical approach to economic analysis, in particular, the objective costs of production approach to economic value. The classical labor theory of value suffers from two related problems. David Ricardo's problem of an invariable measure of value and Karl Marx's transformation problem. So these aren't made up stuff. The transformation problem is obviously what, Samuelson et al. Are trying to figure out. And on the other side, it's sort of the thing against which Marx is talking about, that is Ricardo's, uh, Marx thinking about how Ricardo handles this, how value, and Ricardo is in one sense restricts a whole bunch of different things that on the one hand are useful to get the math to work, or whatever, to get the algebra to work, but also create further problems when we get down to the 20th century. So anyway, invariable measure of value, transformation problem. This thesis proposes to resolve both problems by constructing a more general labor theory of value. So already, the question of generalizing, as well as invoking the idea of a labor theory of value, automatically gets us off into a whole bunch of little, sort of cul-de-sacs about questions of, labor versus labor power, and a variety of other things, as well as the issue of, value itself. So this more general theory provides a new perspective on related issues in the classical theory, including Marx's classification of money capital as an irrational commodity. Money capital as an irrational commodity, the meaning and significance of Piero Sraffa's standard commodity, and that there's a whole point to doing it that way, and it makes the math easier, if nothing else, but it also restricts the kind of analysis that we can make. But you could say that that's just the evolution of the single system argument, that there are a variety of people working on it, working on the the issues of linearity, the coefficients problem, a bunch of other things, and to get that Sraffa getting to or having a standard commodity is really important for ultimately developing other kinds of arguments that relate to single system theory. So, and Luigi Passanetti's restriction of the labor theory to a normative role. Now, that's the other way of dealing with the problem, and you could say that Passanetti is taking on the Sraffian kind of position to really explicate it in a or to push it back into a more productionist or productive kind of position. And it has, he's got the numbers. It kind of works. It works, it sort of represents a kind of position in at least Italian Marxist thought that some people may not have found very useful, but in fact informs still some of the same basic political issues in post-war Italy. But that's another story. According to the classical account of capitalist competition, the scramble for profit causes market prices to gravitate to natural prices. Now, already, just in that sense, we have lots of other kinds of issues that can be problematic. That is, gravitating, as it means something in a variety of ways, but in fact is not so problematic when you can sort of see this as not even necessarily in physical sciences terms, but the fact is that there's something there, and we need to account for it, and it's fine. One shouldn't get too crazy about it, but in fact, you can make that analogy, but whether that analogy is ultimately productive is a whole different question. It just simply that it's a heuristic. You sort of have to sort of say, well, we can sort of talk about it. It's worth considering in our argument. This thesis, that is Ian Wright's thesis, proposes a nonlinear dynamic model of classical gravitation. So you're already, into, it's a nonlinear dynamic model, but it engages still, as I've just sort of intimated, classical gravitation of the physical science sort, in which prices and labor costs converge to a state of mutual consistency and equilibrium. So this is development that, you could say goes further than certain other folks who have applied equilibrium analysis to, the Marxian issues, some of which mathematically work out okay. It's just that other people object to them because they're not, they suspect some sort of reactionary or revisionist purpose in trying to think about this in equilibrium models. I think it's okay to talk about equilibrium, but you need to sort of see it in context, to see it not simply as a static dynamic kind of question, but rather one that oscillates, as it were, between these two kind of static dynamic positions. But anyway, the dynamic model, combined with a general labor theory of value, establishes a lawful relation, or automatically that could be seen as problematic, a lawful, law-like, whatever that means, relation between prices and labor costs, which reconstructs Marx's version of the classical law of value. So, it's a reconstruction, right? It does what Shake wants to do with it, that is, see it as it fits within the context of classical political economy. So anyway, we skip ahead. If capital is mobile, and that's sort of the underlying issue here of what I was just saying about the difference between, or the oscillation, as it were, between static and dynamic, if capital is mobile, then it makes sense to suppose, as Marx did, that money will flee lower performing industries and flood higher performing ones until competition equalizes profitability across industries. Now, that particular goal about equalizing profit is one that, it's following on, Marx's thing about averages and other kinds of things that are serve one purpose, or serve, certain purposes in terms of analyzing stuff. But the big picture is that, it has other contingencies, and Farjun and Markover reject the idea that profit rates equalize. That's the argument I'm suggesting, arguing that what we observe is a distribution. This is to see it in more probabilistic and larger, sort of structural dynamic terms, distribution of profit rates rather than a single uniform rate, which is what Marx is doing. And the crux of the transformation problem may be simply that your original assumption about equalizing profit rates is probably, was that the best way to go? I mean, it's easier to get the math to work, or easier to get your sort of algebraic argument to work, but it doesn't give you, empirically speaking, or does give you kind of real material sort of viability at certain moments. But anyway, that this distribution is not identical. That this distribution is not identical to that of the organic composition of capital, however, means that there's still some transforming left to do. Yeah, I mean, the transformation problem has had this kind of not necessarily that it's closed, but it does have a certain closed logic to it, even if you take it to its more quantitative extremes, more schema, etc. It's still a model in that particular sense. So the transformation problem has provoked controversy within Marxism and derision from without for more than a century, as I've suggested. bourgeois economists in particular, beginning with Ladislaus Borkowitz, and continuing most notoriously, as we've suggested, with Paul Samuelson, have seized on it to argue for the basic inconsistency or vacuousness of Marx's labor theory of value. And there's a lot of ink spilled on that. Some Marxists consider these arguments so damning that they've abandoned the labor theory of value, as in the case of most, that's what I was moving towards, is as in the case of most analytic Marxists. Now, there's ways of talking about this that are good and bad. There's there accusations of methodological individualism and a whole bunch of other kinds of things that that suggests that there wasn't one analytic Marxism that was being talked about. There's actually a variety of them. They kind of got clustered together as a thing called analytic Marxism, but in fact, they're just, you could call them analytic. They're not that, they're as analytic as anything else, but that was kind of a pejorative applied to it, if only because of this quote unquote attack or critique of labor theory of value, as in trying to get rid of it or negate it or erase it. So anyway, that they've abandoned the labor theory of values in the case of both analytic Marxists, or chosen to call any empirically verifiable version of it non-Marxian, as in the case of the value form theorists. You see, this is already the thing, is that, you have, heroes and villains in this whole process. And as I just suggested minutes ago, that value form suffers from that same set of issues. So, without the labor theory of value, the critique of capitalism becomes an abstract ought, unmoored from its class partisanship and divorced from the scientific analysis of capitalist society. Now, so this is, you can argue that, but I think it's unjustified, particularly when you get back to looking at, the range of analytic Marxism, for example, but also where other kinds of arguments go. People needed to defend certain things, and with respect to the history of economic thought of the last 50 years, there's certain pathological issues at work as well, but that's another story. Marxists remain divided over how it should be handled, how close Marx came to solving it, as though this is a problem that can be solved, what it means, and to what extent it matters. And to what extent it matters. You see, that ultimately we have to work through the kind of meaning that this all comes to. The problem itself is simple enough to understand, and Marx is aware of it. That is, labor is the source of all value. Then, the labor values of commodities can be understood as sums of direct labor and indirect labor, that is, commodity inputs. That there's a lot packed in that one statement, one sentence. So, if labor is the source of all value, then the labor values of commodities can be understood as sums of direct labor and indirect labor as commodity inputs. The proportion between the two will, in general, vary, and this fact, that is, the varying organic composition of capital, OCC, across industries, is hard to square with the assumption of a uniform profit rate. Now, it's not that hard to square when you sort of think, as some Marxists do, is to think about it as other kinds of ideas, that it's not about you need to rethink some of the fundamental elements of it. That is, you could talk about energy, for example, or energy potential, or carbon content, or there's a bunch of other ways in which you could sort of configure this, and that is, in fact, or I would assert, is the reasons why you can state stuff like Anthropocene, Capitalocene sort of oppositions. Anyway, so if direct labor alone is the source of surplus value, now that clause there is in itself, sort of a linchpin for the labor theory of value problem. That is, if direct labor alone is the source of surplus value. And I would assert to you that if you make that statement, you've already gone too far. You have to sort of go back, reverse, back up a little bit to think about what counts as surplus value, and what is it measuring relative to the separations that exist relative to the formation of value as measured against absolute and relative kind of surpluses. So anyway, that may have already confused the issue, but I think you just sort of need to back up from the argument and not go too far. Prices must evidently diverge from these quote-unquote pure labor values. Already that's a problem. Pure labor values to get a uniform rate of profit. That gets us back to the uniform rate of profit problem, which is related to, obviously, you can have uniform rates of profit, but what is it that you need to get to in order to create a measure such as a uniform rate of profit? There's all these other kinds of things that come to grips with that. None the least of which is price questions, and then ultimately income questions. So there's a whole bunch of other things that just stating uniform rate of profit may already have gone sort of off, make this problem sort of already off the rails. And the challenge for the labor theory of value is to show that embodied labor, you're already into the weeds when you talk about embodied labor. Now, that's worth a whole other argument that we've talked about elsewhere, and that is this idea of labor embodiment is not as, you over sort of reify the problem when you start talking about embodiment, because it engages all kinds of other kinds of implications, and that it's not about embodiment such per se, it's about a way in which you can think about embodiment, which is not the same thing. It's like the difference between ontology and social ontology in that sense. And in fact, well, that's the way I think it could be argued. But anyway, values cannot. Embodied labor still governs these prices. That is, that values cannot be considered superfluous and deprecated in favor of a subjective view of price as only expressing supply and demand, as neoclassical economics would have it. The transformation problem then, after you've sort of made this kind of set of decisions about supply and demand and price and quantity, the transformation problem then is the question of whether any lawful transformation between values and prices exists. So already, you're dealing with a lot of things that seem a little too vague, but they're not vague at all. You just have to decide the framework, or the algebraic model, or whatever, in order to get to figure this stuff out. So, Ian Wright's solution / the solution of the transformation problem is the clearest and most conclusive response that the author came across. This essay is the key second chapter of his doctoral dissertation, also available as an earlier standalone journal publication. Wright does not reject either the linear production modeling approach, which linear production modeling approaches is kind of where what's implied at certain levels of organization, that sort of an acceptable way of approaching some of the issues. And note, of course, that linear production modeling is in some ways ideologically neutral. That already that may be a problem, but you can say that even under actually existing socialism and capitalism, you can see that they they share that kind of methodology. So anyway, linear production modeling approach, or the uniform profit rate assumption of Marx's neoclassical and leftist critics. See, that's what I'm saying. Instead, he calls attention to historically specific capitalist social costs that are omitted from the traditional labor value calculation. Now, this is where you can get into the weeds, because you begin to try to say, well, there's a structure of accumulation, but you know you need to be more specific about it, and in terms of social necessity, or social structure of accumulation, and have you really gotten more from it by moving in that direction? That's a whole there's at least a decade spent on that problem. Instead, he calls attention to historically specific capitalist social costs that are omitted from the traditional labor value calculation. His concept of super integrated labor values. Now, this has a whole bunch of other implications for development theory that we won't go into here, but you can say that there's lots of these things that build on other things. And, it's not like a house of cards or Jenga or something. You sort of need to see all this together and not worry that, like Jenga, if you pull the wrong thing, everything falls down. So anyway, his concept of super integrated labor values is invaluable, even if this term itself is a little clunky. In the 7th chapter of Wright's thesis, he presents a nonlinear dynamic model of classical macrodynamics, which gives a plausible account of the process by which the nominal cost and real cost structures of the economy grope toward a state of mutual consistency. That may be the best that we can get from this relative to our ability to tackle, sort of big data, large scale, structural dynamic questions. So the takeaway from Wright's thesis is two-sided. Marx and subsequent Marxists are found guilty of a category error, and category errors are actually really important and probably a linchpin to understanding a whole bunch of other different points of view on questions of Marxism that are not taken up by most people. That is, to consider category error problems. But anyway, and the causal claim traditionally associated with labor theory of value, that labor costs are the sole cause or regulator of natural prices, does not generalize beyond simple commodity production. So already you can see this is kind of a closed circle with certain other kinds of issues at work. So, more importantly, though, Wright's finding undermines the basis for the claim that a labor theory of value must be logically incoherent, because prices and classical labor values are quantitatively incommensurable in linear production models. Now, you could make that statement, but in fact, a properly constructed linear production models could actually accommodate that if properly designed, and particularly in the context of non sort of, if you avoid overdetermining a linear model like that, you could actually include they can become more commensurable in that sense. Now, the incommensurability is sort of useful for other things, but anyway, and upholds the quote, the semantic claim traditionally associated with labor theory of value, the classical gravitation of the physical science type establishes a lawful relationship between natural prices. Now, remember, natural is not natural in the chunky granola sense. Between natural prices, as in conventional prices, and labor costs, even beyond simple commodity production. And so, you've already stated the problem that in some cases it gets oversimplified relative to commodity production. And yes, that is an underlying assumption that comes from, Stropha, etc. But you want to move to a position where it's not that simple, and reducing it to simple, doesn't really it gives you better mathematical results, but I would assert doesn't solve some of the fundamental issues, which are logical questions, which are larger, as it say, category error issues. But anyway, the transformation problem, it turns out, derives from a fundamental tension not only in capital, but in all of Marxism, between the view from within capitalism and the view from without. Now, let me just stop there and say, is there a view from without for capitalism? And that's a whole other question that I was just merely suggesting in the idea that there is pre-capital formations are kind of under-attended to. But that's a whole other issue. But from within capitalism and the view from without between social laws and natural laws. Now, note here that natural laws, of course, is the physical science, blah, 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 that, the natural laws question is as confusing as some people who would try to reapply, quote-unquote, natural law in the current legal context. But that's a whole other story. Between explaining what is and oughts, that is, advocating what ought to be. So this critique here is Nia Fromm's critique of Ian Wright's, but I think she hits it on the head in terms of suggesting that Wright, is sort of headed in the right direction and sort of identifies all the kind of pieces that you sort of need to deal with the question. And so, one needs to, in 2023, still, and it's not that much later than that, to consider that these things are still all contingent and sort of float around and need to be sort of dealt with in interesting ways. So, this is the introduction from Wright. David Ricardo defines natural prices as stable exchange ratios that are independent of accidental and temporary deviations between supply and demand, and he defines reproducible commodities as those, quote, that may be multiplied almost without any assignable limit if we are disposed to bestow the labor necessary to obtain them. Now, Ricardo observed that the natural prices of reproducible commodities vary with the distribution of income, whereas their real costs of production, measured in labor time, do not. So already you have this kind of difference issue, right? In consequence, labor costs cannot fully explain the structure of natural prices. This explanatory gap creates two famous problems: the classical labor theory of value, that is, Ricardo's problem of an invariable measure of value, and Karl Marx's transformation problem, which is cited above. These problems are the major reason why modern economists consider the classical labor theory of value is at best incomplete, or worse, logically incoherent. That's the kind of Samuelson kind of position that, well, you can't answer the question. There's no way of quantifying it. It is just too vague or whatever, indeterminate in that sense. Nonetheless, dissatisfaction with economic foundations based on the shallow and superficial framework of supply and demand concepts, Duncan Foley, has the shallow and superficial framework of supply and demand concept, which, that is the issue, to try and state how supply and demand concepts tend, in the neoclassical context particularly, that it is a shallow and superficial framework. So anyway, has ensured a continued interest in the classical problems. Despite significant intellectual effort, however, the classical problems remain essentially insoluble. Now, that's an important point to make, that to assert that from classical issues, and Howard and King are kind of worth looking at because they have a good handle on the comparative stuff. So now what's interesting and why Wright is interesting to me, partially, and not simply because Wittgenstein actually, related to was there at Cambridge at the same time as Straffa. Uh, there's a whole bunch of research that could happen there, but whatever. For ordinary language philosophers, Passmore, chapter 18, such as Gilbert Ryle and Ludwig Wittgenstein, the underlying cause of a long-lived and insoluble problem is often a hidden conceptual confusion or mistake. And, without getting into a thing on ordinary language philosophy, but that's kind of the underlying issue, and that you need to, if you are searching for a kind of procedure or a kind of this is when you get into, well, not the weeds necessarily, but if you were talking about Austin, for example, J.L. Austin, in this context, that's kind of where you begin to look for methodology, that it lies, as I've suggested with this notion of deconstruction, that it lies in issues about difference or replacement of, a sort of, not necessarily a lexical replacement, but something that allows you to see this sort of plane of difference, as it were. But anyway, the problem is insoluble because the conceptual framework in which the problem is stated is itself faulty. This is like the difference between early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein. But anyway, the Tractatus versus the philosophical investigations. But anyway, the problem must therefore be defined or dissolved by applying, and this is conceptual analysis. It's an entire thing. It's a whole field. And what it deals with, with all due respect and without going into a long lecture on it, is to deal with this series of correspondences, which, if you want to get into the semiotics of it, is exactly the mapping problem that exists for identified by a bunch of other folks who are semioticians. But anyway, that's another story. But worth looking at because the mechanisms of that resemble, and from a conceptual analysis point of view, work by other philosophers on some of these categorical problems. So anyway, for instance, Ryle introduced the term category mistake to denote the conceptual error of expecting some concept or thing to possess properties it cannot have. For example, John Doe may be a relative, friend, enemy, or stranger to Richard Roe, but he cannot be any of these things to the average taxpayer. So, if John Doe continues to think of the average taxpayer as a fellow citizen, he will tend to think of him as an elusive, an insubstantial man, a ghost who is everywhere yet nowhere. And that's the issue underlying certain elements of ordinary language philosophy, is to think about how is it that sets both intersect and union and combine or unify. Now, so the argument of this essay is the contradictions of the classical labor theory of value derived from a theoretically interesting category mistake. Specifically, the mistake of supposing that classical labor values, which measure strictly technical costs of production, are of the same logical type as natural prices, which measure social costs of production, and in consequence, labor theories about labor values and prices under appropriate equilibrium conditions are mutually consistent. This is not a hard slog for, mathematically speaking. Since the supposition is mistaken, Ricardo's search for an invariable measure of value and Marx's search for a transformation between labor values and prices attempt to discover a commensurate relationship between concepts defined by an incommensurate cost accounting conventions. This is what I was talking about, months ago when I was talking about, what is it that Marxist accountants, people who teach accounting from a Marxist point of view, what is it that is important from their perspective to sort of work through some of these problems? They therefore seek a insubstantial or an elusive and insubstantial man or ghost that obviously reifies in another direction. The identification of a category mistake allows for a resolution of the classical problem by giving prominence to distinctions which our ordinary forms of language make us easily overlook. Such distinctions can then solve, or more accurately, dissolve the problems. This chapter therefore introduces a new distinction lacking in the classical labor theory between a technical measure of labor and a total measure of labor costs, where technical labor cost corresponds to the classical concept, and total labor cost includes additional real costs of production incurred in virtue of non-technical or social conditions of production, such as production financed by a capitalist class. So right here, you have the accumulation problem, sort of some steps that you can get to understanding the social structure of accumulation arguments and models, and to be able to state, ways in which you can talk about the difference between technical costs and labor costs. And without getting into a whole bunch of other things, but you could argue, and I'm not going to argue it here, but that artificial intelligence actually allows us a way to sort of think about this problem in ways that we haven't been able to think about it before, and to answer questions that Marx brings up about quote unquote general intellect. But that's another thing for another place. And production financed by a capitalist class obviously implicates this whole business that we've been talking about before, about financialization and the difference between merchant capital and financialized capital and industrial capital, etc. The more refined conceptual framework separates theoretical concerns that are conflated in the classical theory. For example, labor values apply to distribution-independent questions about an economy, such as the productivity of labor over time and the quantity of surplus labor supplied by workers to capitalists, i.e., technical issues or questions in the theory of labor exploitation. See, we've finally gotten to, some fundamental kind of things that we need to talk about. Whereas total labor values apply to distribution-dependent questions, such as the relationship between nominal prices and the actual labor time required to produce commodities, i.e., issues in the theory of economic value. So here is sort of spelled out, I would assert, all of the different terms under which you have to make these kind of arguments about value, or value price issues. And you can articulate them, I think, with this kind of framework of talking about distribution-dependent questions as opposed to distribution-dependent questions. Anyway, the classical problem is dissolved by generalizing the classical labor theory to apply both concepts of labor cost in the appropriate context. In consequence, I sketch in an initial and incomplete manner a new theoretical object, a more general labor theory of value with an invariable measure of value and without a transformation problem. So you sort of see this is particular objective here. I sketch out in an initial and incomplete manner because there's far too many other things to get fixed in this kind of modeling. A new theoretical object that is a more general labor theory of value that allows us to talk about invariable measures of value and without suffering the problem of that identified by also too many people, the transformation problem. The structure of this chapter is followed. The next three sections specify how the classical problems manifest in the simplest possible case, that of a capitalist economy in steady state equilibrium. The subsequent section thus then introduced the concept of a total labor cost in contradistinction to the classical concept by applying conceptual analysis to the concept labor value. The following three sections formally define total labor costs in the case of steady state equilibrium. So already, we have some constraints on the model. The final three sections explain how the new distinction dissolves the classical problems. Now, it may be a straw problem in some ways, but that's a whole nother story. But that's kind of what is going on here. And yes, we have diagrams. You three commodity model and a worker household, and you can sort of model this as a kind of sort of inductive thing. And yes, when you lay it out, you can put it in a matrix form, and that is the state of many other stuff. But there's more writing involved, and I just wanted to throw in the diagram because yes, it can be diagrammed, and that wherein lies the mathematical solutions or the quantitative solutions to some of our issues here, not simply as a way that certain empirical problems are solved and that are non-generalizable, but that are solvable. And I think that's, we sort of have to come to grips with that. The classical labor theory of value commits the category mistake, remember, category mistake, of supposing that classical labor values, which measure strictly technical or material cost of production, are of the same logical type as a natural price, that is conventional, prices, the prices that are sort of out there that, in some ways correspond to market prices, whatever, which measure non-technical or social costs of production, and therefore labor values and prices under appropriate equilibrium conditions are mutually consistent. So this is the whole point of trying to do all this, is to look for this kind of commensurability, mutual consistency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This category mistake is the cause of Ricardo's problem of an invariable measure of value and Marx's transformation problem. Now, this essay has drawn a new distinction lacking in the classical theory between a technical measure of labor cost and a total measure of labor cost, where a total labor cost includes additional real costs incurred in virtue of non-technical conditions of production, such as, and this is where it's Department 1 and Department 2 issues, that is a production financed by money capital. See, this is where we're headed. This is the way in which you can talk about how financialization ultimately not trickles down, but has implications for a much larger connected system. And it is necessary in order to solve, make judgments on these things. Classical labor values in this more refined conceptual framework apply to distribution-independent questions about an economy, such as the productivity of labor or measuring the surplus labor supplied by workers, produced by workers, whereas total labor values apply to distribution-dependent questions, such as the relationship between nominal prices and the actual labor time required to produce commodities, that is, issues in the theory of economic value. So it's this way of trying to get around, and maybe it doesn't work, but we'll try and look at it and see, kind of get to it as it does, of trying to solve the transformation problem without getting bogged down in certain kind of restrictive concepts. And as I suggested, it is to frame this entire problem as a category problem, so it has more as it were, flexibility among the way in which we get stuff to correspond. And to follow Cockshot's work and a bunch of other folks, you can make these kinds of judgments without sacrificing your own commitments to class struggle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The classical problem is resolved by generalizing the classical labor theory to apply to both concepts in the appropriate context. So there's a lot packed in there, but it is a very standard social science problem in the sense of finding things that are um, uh, uh, dependent and independent kinds of questions. Anyway, the category mistake has misdirected. Has misdirected theoretical attention toward the contradictions and away from the fact that a commodity's natural price, that is the conventional price, try not to confuse that idea, that there's this sort of natural price, is the wage bill of the total coexisting labor supplied to produce it. That's theorem one. That, that it's one fact that we know certainly need to come grips with. Why ridding ourselves of long-standing conceptual confusions, we discover the logical possibility of a new theoretical object, which we saw referred to above, a more general labor theory of value with an invariable measure of value and without a transformation problem. So it's not like you sort of forget that it exists, is you figure out a way in which you can sort of, as it were, isolate it so that you can argue it all you want, but that it ultimately doesn't, kind of deter you from moving forward, which is kind of what the whole problem of the last, however many decades of working through the transformation problem is sort of produced. And you could argue that, and I will argue that sometime, someplace, somewhere. And I think it's argued by some folks. That's kind of the difference between, as I've mentioned before, some of the issues that can or can't be tackled with, for example, the Japanese approach to certain issues underlying this. That on the one hand, the Japanese have a better handle on on one side, on one part of the problem, which is, and I will argue, that is ignored in the quote unquote Western Marxist context. So that's another thing. Um, have I talked enough? I think I've talked enough now. Yes, I've talked enough now. But anyway, I'm happy to say that my article on the Marxist transformation problem has now been published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. See, the recognition occurred. After a little negotiation with Oxford University, I'm able to link to a free version of the article from my website, and there it is. Here it is. And yes, there's math here, but it kind of works, and it allows the transformation problem to not get in the way of where modern capitalism in the 21st century sort of has evolved into. It gives you a way, not the way, but a way to talk about globalization issues, development problems, super profits, a bunch of other things, or at least I would assert that it allows us to do that, and it may take a lot of work, and whatever. Marxist transformation problem in Passanetti's vertically integrated subsystems, because I will assert, and you can argue that vertically integrated subsystems actually, is not a problematic concept. I mean, it's not new, certainly, and is not symptomatic to sort of high capitalism, but you can apply it, and then this would take a lot of work, but I think you can apply it to pre-capitalist formations, and that's another story. Anyway, so see, we haven't gotten too far at all, and but Wright is talking about what what he promises, what he can get to out of the article. I think I can get to the end of this his précis to make this, and then we can stop. This article is quite theoretical, mentioned previously. Here I want to be a little more blunt in order to simplify the main message. First, a frequent claim, both on the right and left of the political spectrum, is that the classical labor theory of value, and especially Marx's version, is provably false in virtue of a transformation problem. Samuelson. My paper unequivocally demonstrates the opposite. I prove that equilibrium prices, even a capitalist economy with positive profits, represent the labor time actually supplied by workers. So the central claim and intent of the classical labor theory of value is, quote unquote, on the money. Don't let anyone tell you that the labor theory of value is false or suffers from intractable logical problems ever again. If they don't want to listen, feel free to send them my way. The result upends over, as I've suggested, this result upends over 100 years of conventional academic wisdom. So why have such fairly obvious theorems about the relationship between equilibrium prices and labor time been missed for so long? And then there's a suggestion, and you could argue an explanation here, which goes back to the issue, as I mentioned before, of category mistakes. And I'm not going to defend, where Wright is going with his sort of this approach, but it is linked there so that you can, under his website called Dark Age Marxism, which obviously has its own implications, but that's another story. I just suggest that this points us in the right direction, and then we need to sort of deal with it at that moment. So, second, there is a logical problem with the classical labor theory of value and Marx's version of it. In other words, the critics, whatever their underlying motivations, have a point. That is, transformation problems do arise if we make a certain kind of conceptual error of comparing prices which reflect both natural and institutional conditions of production with classical labor values which reflect only the natural conditions. So already in this one sentence, we see the kind of breakpoint between that occurred at sort of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, between institutionalist approaches and neoclassical approaches. But anyway, so the calumny heaped upon the labor theory of value isn't a pure example of an ideological attack by a ruling elite that senses a threat to its material interests. Unfortunately, life, including the development of theory over long time scales, is more complex than that. Yes, the critics have a point, but that point is easily resolved, and the end result is a better labor theory of value, which preserves all of Marx's insights. So, it may be excessively theoretical, and we'll get to the third point and stop. But I think it's really important to note that applying this degree of analysis on the issue of ultimately what counts as abstract within this whole business, abstract versus concrete, if you want to talk about it that way, and to say that you can, no different than the distinction between labor power and labor itself, you can actually work through some of these problems without a lot of controversy, and people who sort of claim logical error, there's no logical error. You just have to sort of pay attention further and begin to refine some ways in which you set up the argument. So anyway, third, I don't expect my paper and the associated development of a more general labor theory of value to have immediate impact. The current configuration of forces are inimical to it. And I still have a great deal of work ahead of me to fully explain and develop it. He certainly does. There's demand for straightforward defenses of Marx's theory of value, since that's a simple story that might appear at first glance to retain the Lakatos or Lakatosian hardcore of A Lakatosian hardcore is talking about its sort of consistency as a research program. Lakatosian hardcore of Marxist theory. But my paper will disappoint those readers since I accept the validity of the existence of a transformation problem, and in fact, I sharpen the contradictions that give rise to it. So you can be totally thrown off by his stuff. There's also demand for straightforward rejections of Marx's theory of value, since that's also a simple story, with the added benefit of excising talk of economic exploitation and the theft-based nature of capitalist property relations for the economy and popular political discourse. But this paper will also disappoint those readers, since I point out how to naturally resolve the problems of the classical theory. So readers with established sympathies or antipathies to the classical theory of value will find my conclusions counterintuitive, since they contradict many long-standing and seemingly well-established theoretical positions on both sides. The debate does have on both sides. Claiming that you're all wrong isn't a popular message, especially those with existing sunk costs in a wrong position. And in fact, existing sunk costs in a wrong position can define a whole bunch of people. You can even argue that in modern money theory, that kind of distinction exists. But anyway, fourth, why is a theory of economic value politically important? Do we need one? Very briefly, yes, because fundamentally, we need to have an accurate and true understanding of our current mode of production if we are to replace it with a better one, namely socialism. No successful political project can afford to ignore science, because only true ideas are ultimately effective. Lots more to say here, of course, but not today. No, indeed. Finally, the article is theoretical and it requires knowledge of linear algebra production theory. Yeah. So, he's already previewed the problem that exists, if you need to have a bunch of skills to sort of work through it. But he's in the right direction. It's a direction that has always been there. It's just not enough people pursued it, because you needed to sort of figure out that there's all this noise that you sort of have to wade through to sort of get to a fundamental issue that actually most of the people who argue these points, once you get to it, would probably agree. So anyway, underlying the underlying ideas are easy to understand. I created a video that I hope delivers the main insights in a more visual form. So this is, right, trying to make sense of all this, and you may not get the point of this little video here, but I hope you'll take a look at it, and we can talk about that next week. Note that I've included all kinds of other crap here about TSSI and a bunch of other things that are, not necessary to know necessarily, but you can see how and then the counter argument, or the argument, a cynical argument, I suppose, that is the 20th century version of Marxism is not Marxism. Well, at post-Marxism, everything following Marx as opposed to post-Marx is sort of that anyway, but that's another story. And then this is from the collection that is from Kleiman's collection on value, which does represent a certain point of view, but the book is constructed in an interesting way to sort of, kind of straw person the front end of the argument, even though I think it is, as I say, a straw man. But, and I wonder whether, people like David Feldman, sort of really ultimately agreed to that or just sort of capitulated. But that's another story. Anyway, I'm going to stop here because and let's see if anyone actually asked questions.
Seems like
Yes.
splitting hairs. Splitting hairs.
Sorry?
This seems like splitting hairs.
Yes. But considering that people drew very serious lines in the discourse between whether you did or you didn't, or you rejected or accepted. It really drew a lot of lines together, and some people, either shunned or disallowed or discriminated against a certain other kind of position. And then there's a whole underlying pathology that's worth discussing at some other time. But that's a whole other set of issues. I think once you get sort of back to the theoretical question, what Wright is talking about here is at least one way. I don't think it's the only way, but one way of getting at the problem. So anyway, let me stop because I've already yacked too much.
It's like, Marx's
Uh,
main critique that capitalism is doomed still holds.
oh yeah, no, it's not like it doesn't. Um, uh, you know, uh, wait a second. What did I do here? Did I? Uh, damn it! I'm trying to see whether I shut the. God, did I shut the live stream off?
I still see it says live on my